Around the world, college students are uniting and rising up to demand that our universities divest from the destructive, corrupt, failing,
I'm done with fossil fuels,
and unjust fossil fuel industry. And we're scoring win after win after win. But how did we get here? In 2010, a group of Swarthmore students visited a man named Larry Gibson in West Virginia. His family's land was an island of green in a moonscape of devastation from mountaintop removal coal mining. It was a wasteland, the ground itself poisonous and full of heavy metals. He invited people from all over the world to visit and see mountaintop removal up close. His neighbors told students about their poisoned water, rare cancers, and lack of jobs. They were intimidated by the coal industry and received death threats. They felt helpless fighting for their health and their land. Larry told the students, "If you go home and don't do anything, then I've wasted my time." The group went back to Pennsylvania. Though their college had organized this trip and taught them about the destruction of mountaintop removal, Swarthmore College was invested in the very companies carrying it out. Their money was bumping up the stock prices of the corporations strong-arming and threatening West Virginians. The school righteously pointed a finger and criticized mountaintop removal, but behind the scenes, they were happy to excuse it as long as it was making them a profit.
The students learned of the success of the movement to divest from apartheid in South Africa in the 80s and 90s and found inspiration for their own situation. Divestment is most simply defined as the targeted selling off of assets, but its power has been far greater than that. Condemning and refusing to support an unjust system revokes its social license and sends a clear message that its abuses are not accepted. During apartheid, students had demanded that universities sell off their support for corporations operating in South Africa, ditching businesses that condoned racial apartheid. When these universities acted together with businesses and individuals, selling shares in apartheid-supporting businesses had a real financial impact. Divestment is a powerful statement and decisively rebukes the injustices and destruction fueled by a business or industry. Since the turn of the century, a nationwide tobacco divestment campaign had seriously stigmatized and financially damaged big tobacco. This tactic has a strong history of forcing institutions to put their money where their mouth is. Swarthmore students saw that divestment would be the most effective way to leverage the power of their institution to fight the industries that were poisoning people in West Virginia. They gave their university an opportunity to do the right thing, to take definitive action rather than claim to be moral leaders while funding deadly injustices. Frontline communities have been fighting fossil fuel extraction for decades, and divestment allows us to leverage our power as students and organize in solidarity with communities that have the most at stake in environmental and climate fights. The tactic is new, but the struggle is ancient. So they started demanding fossil fuel divestment in 2010. Their campaign kickstarted the campus divestment movement, and the movement grew fast.
In 2012, 350.org launched Fossil Free, a fossil fuel divestment campaign targeted at cities, universities, and other institutions, inspired by the work of student-led campaigns. Fossil Free amplified the urgency and visibility of the issue, and more schools joined the movement. In 2013, the Fossil Fuel Divestment Student Network was formed as a coalition of college and university campaigns. Students across campuses stood together, refusing to allow their universities to invest in industries that were compromising their futures. They used their experience to train new student organizers and to share resources, and the movement continued to grow. In 2015, Fossil Free organized Global Divestment Day. We highlighted our power with over 450 events in 60 countries, demanding that our institutions, governments, cities, and businesses divest from fossil fuels. We created a mandate for our leaders to take real climate action. We were part of a global movement. Billions, then trillions of dollars were divested by schools, religious institutions, and businesses, cities, and nations. In 2016, the UMass school system divested from fossil fuels, setting the standard for campuses nationwide and showing students that divestment is achievable. 2016 also saw the No Dakota Access Pipeline protests, which captured national and international attention and focused the larger environmental movement on taking on extractivist, exploitative business interests. Interest in divestment grew as a way to take on corporate power. In 2018, Divest Ed launched a team of full-time campus organizers, bringing resources, knowledge, and coordination to student activists. With this coordination, our movement gained strength we never had before. The release of the IPCC's 2018 special report added a new sense of urgency to the fight against climate change. To avoid catastrophic global disaster, we needed to cut emissions by 50% in 12 years. Millions started taking to the streets demanding climate action. At the end of that year, the Sunrise Movement and thousands of young people sat in along the halls of Congress demanding a Green New Deal and a just transition. We saw, more than ever before, that if we wanted a livable future, we were going to have to fight for it.
In 2019, the youth climate strikes rallied 7.6 million people worldwide. In November, hundreds of protesters stormed the field of the Harvard-Yale football game in a coordinated effort to demonstrate that nobody wins when their university endowments are invested in fossil fuels and Puerto Rican debt. 25 more schools joined in coordinated support on their own campuses.
Nobody wins while Brown pretends it's not a political instrument. When Tufts University asks for justice, nobody wins. Nobody wins. Nobody wins.
Nobody wins.
Nobody wins.
Nobody wins.
Nobody wins.
We proved our power as an international movement. We're training together. We're joining together to turn our individual campus actions into national headlines, and we're turning up the heat. In February 2020, we organized the biggest day of campus divestment action in history, Fossil Fuel Divestment Day. Over 60 campuses around the world took united action to demand that our schools and our futures be fossil-free. And these efforts have been paying off. Middlebury College, the University of British Columbia, Georgetown University, Brown University, the entire University of California system, and more than 150 other schools have divested from fossil fuels. Over $14 trillion have been divested to date.
Example for future generations. We are showing them that we must protect Mother Earth's balancing flooding at all costs. We ask of you that this is not your only time that you advocate and protect Mother Earth. We ask that you continue this work after today.
Divestment is our tactic, justice is our goal. From the fight against apartheid to the fight for climate justice, we fight against a few people with power destroying the lives and livelihoods of others for their own profit. We fight against the exploitation of our planet. Our movement is a part of the larger collaborative effort to ensure that every person can live, knowing that their safety, their health, their financial well-being will never be compromised by greed. Many of our universities were founded on systems of white supremacy, patriarchy, classism, and other forms of oppression. When a university refuses to divest, they're sending a clear message to the fossil fuel executives that it is acceptable to poison air and water for money, to profit off the backs of low-wage workers, to take advantage, especially of Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities who suffer the most from the fossil fuel industry's ruthless extraction and pollution. This silence and refusal to act is exposing their willingness to turn a blind eye to injustice in the pursuit of profit.
That is one reason we seek divestment from fossil fuels, but we are also trying to return wealth to the people that our universities stole it from. But why target schools at all? Are there more effective targets? It is easy to underestimate the power our institutions have. They have huge social, political, and financial influence. Universities hold tremendous power in our communities. In most cities, universities are among the biggest employers and, in some cases, the biggest landowners too. That translates to a surprising amount of power in city and state politics. Financially, universities are respected, conservative growth investors and hold real sway in the market. As it stands, the lessons our schools are teaching and the messages they are sending to their communities and the world is that they condone profiting off stolen indigenous land. They tacitly encourage underpaying or misclassifying low-income workers, pumping up prices, snubbing the needs of first-generation students, or displacing marginalized populations in their hungry, gentrifying expansion. That's a powerfully destructive message. Our universities' refusal to change their business practices is not an apolitical decision. They know the consequences of their actions in our communities and in the financial market. They know the destruction caused by fossil fuels, and they know they are profiting from climate chaos. They know what is right, they simply choose not to do it.
Fossil-Free Penn has submitted multiple formal proposals to the Board of Trustees. Each was dozens of pages of research on the dangerous consequences of fossil fuel extraction. Consequences that plague South Philly residents with chronic asthma and near-deadly fire explosions. Consequences that Penn has no excuse to ignore. Penn has tried to justify their inaction by saying, well, we don't want to make a political comment, or the numbers just aren't in. Never once has Penn uttered a word against the people most responsible, the fossil fuel industry. They don't want to make a political statement? That continued silence is more than enough to show where they stand. By choosing silence, Penn is perpetuating the fossil fuel-driven carbon emissions that undermine its own students' futures. By choosing silence, Penn is blocking climate change regulation that its own researchers have said are necessary for a just, livable future. By choosing silence, Penn is standing idly by as Philly's dirty plants are intentionally and disproportionately affecting low-income families and communities of color. By choosing silence, Penn is disregarding their power, purpose, and status as leaders. Not divesting is just as loud of a political statement as divesting, and much more deadly. The fossil fuel divestment movement is not solely about financial decisions and carbon emissions. It's about mobilizing higher education to take a stand, raise their voice, leverage their prestige for change, and disrupt the false normalcy of a political system that fails to protect us and a fossil fuel economy that continues to prioritize profit over human health.
That's the bottom line. Doing nothing is not free. Doing nothing is not apolitical.
We are no longer talking in future tense. The climate crisis is here. We knew for decades that we would need to drastically change our energy infrastructure or face devastating consequences. The fossil fuel billionaires had the resources to make that change with us, but they thought that they could make more money by holding on to burning fossil fuels. Their greed led them to use their profits to hinder any attempt to clean the planet. Oil and gas corporations have spent on the order of $125 billion lobbying U.S. politicians every year. They bought tax breaks for themselves and obstructed support for renewable technologies. They stymied regulation that would protect the environment. They disseminated fake science to mislead the public about climate change. They placed extraction sites and plants near vulnerable communities who didn't have the means to fight back. Today, they tout their own sustainable solutions, but their actions over decades have made one thing clear. The fossil fuel corporation's business model is predicated upon causing environmental destruction, exacerbating inequalities, and endangering lives. Now, we are facing the consequences of that. In 2020, Wet'suwet'en peoples suffer the legacy of colonialism as they fight against fossil fuel infrastructure. Crops around Southeast Asia are failing, and people are starving as the Mekong River failed to flood for the first time in living memory. Bush and forest fires have displaced over 21 indigenous tribes in California and thousands of individuals in Australia. Around the world, over 10,000 people die every day from air pollution. We can see the need for change and are frustrated by the hypocrisy of higher education. Our institutions claim to prepare us for the future while investing in industries that are destroying our chances of having one. This is what we're fighting. We refuse to continue to incentivize injustice.
We fight to protect our planet and our people because we know it's morally right. But the fight we face on the ground is often a financial one. People who stand in the way of divestment for years have fought us with outdated ideas that an investment portfolio needs fossil fuels to be diverse and be successful. But that is a lie. The world is changing, and it is an absolute fallacy that protecting the planet means sacrificing returns. Major cities like London, Stockholm, and Copenhagen have fully divested and report no negative impact on their portfolios. Whether you care about making the world a better place or not, divestment has become financially imperative. Fossil fuels are drastically underperforming market averages, and that trend is just beginning. Goldman Sachs recently downgraded Exxon's stock rating to sell and called them a risk to long-term returns. BlackRock Group, previously one of the world's biggest investors in coal, is ditching it. And this is happening in part because divestment is making it happen.
But I'm done with fossil fuels. They're done. Yeah, they're just done. We're starting to see divestment all over the world. We're starting to see the companies just regard them as, big pension funds saying, listen, we're not going to own them anymore. We're in the death knell phase.
It is now cheaper to build from scratch commercial wind or solar farms than to continue to operate existing coal or natural gas power plants. Commercial solar prices have fallen by 90% in the last 10 years, and these costs will only continue to go down as the technology advances. These renewable technologies are projected to produce 75% of the world's energy by 2050, not because they help us reduce our carbon footprint, which they do, but because they increasingly produce the cheapest energy. The world is changing. Fossil fuels are simply bad investments. If our institutions are not divesting, they can no longer justify that decision with financial arguments. The numbers say that doing the right thing costs them nothing. And our stools still refuse to act. And that should make you frustrated. We recognize that a diversity of tactics is required in the fight for climate justice. We choose fossil fuel divestment because as students, our leverage is limited, but being part of the university system gives us a unique opportunity to demand change from within. In pushing for divestment, we fight for climate justice by weakening the fossil fuel industry and unjust power structures in higher education and strengthening student power. We will keep fighting together until our schools right their wrongs and exemplify justice to their students and the world. We will keep fighting, whether we're able to be together on our campuses or not.
COVID-19 is showing us every day the crises that many people have been experiencing long before the pandemic began. Unfair wages, job insecurity, no paid sick leave, and a lack of healthcare coverage. Just like the climate crisis, the coronavirus crisis reveals persisting injustices. Exposure to poor air quality and limited access to health and preventative care have made COVID-19 mortality rates in Black and Brown communities disproportionately high. Millions are unemployed, and the country only runs it all because millions more risk their lives every day in essential jobs. While most understand the failures of the U.S. government, our universities should not be off the hook either. Despite multi-billion-dollar endowments, many universities abandoned their communities just as the virus began to hit hardest. Contracted staff were laid off with no pay. Students were evicted with just days' notice, often indiscriminately of whether or not they had a safe home to return to. As universities failed to support the most vulnerable members of our campus communities, it was the students that rose up and organized last-minute mutual aid efforts to keep workers and fellow students afloat. It is absurd that students had to do what our billion-dollar universities refused to, and we are still organizing and fighting for equitable grading, tuition and housing refunds, and compensation for workers. In the scramble to deal with the pandemic today, divestment might feel like an afterthought, but it's not. We have learned that our schools will not do the right thing unless we demand it. We have learned the deadly consequences of ignoring the warnings of science and failing to act to prevent a crisis. We cannot allow our universities nor society to return to business as usual.
It is critical to ensure that the funds successfully divested from fossil fuel corporations do not end up in the private prison industrial complex, military industrial complex, or any other industry that profits off of pain, injustice, and systemic oppression, but are reinvested elsewhere. Reinvestment can look like investing in the renewable energy sector or other climate solutions to fund the just transition. Reinvestment can mean working together with local business owners, workers, and politicians to create community loan funds, invest in small businesses, and promote community projects that strengthen the local economy and uplift community members. Reinvestment can mean supporting the public school districts around our campuses, in the communities that have been displaced by campus expansion and gentrification. While divestment messaging centers around the harm caused by the fossil fuel industry, reinvestment centers on a vision of what an economy without those harmful industries looks like. If this crisis teaches us anything, it's that resilience and justice only come from prioritizing the success of the community, rather than the short-term returns for investors. Reinvestment can seem daunting, and it looks different for each school. Incorporating it into our campaigns will take work. Nevertheless, it is a critical step in order for us to truly embody our values and can be achieved independent of a divestment win. We envision a world where greed does not trump empathy, where money doesn't hold power over the government, where no one is one emergency away from financial disaster, where communities are safe and habitable for the people within them, where institutions are held accountable to the needs of the public, where Indigenous peoples have governance over their native land, and their leadership is followed by those who come from a legacy of colonization, where we will achieve our collective liberation. We envision a just world.
After all, divestment was never just about the money. It's about rewriting the way our schools see justice and equality. In the words of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, we can be whatever we have the courage to see. We will refuse to incentivize injustice. We will fight for the earth and fight for a just world. And we need you. Join the movement.